Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca. I'm an accredited practicing dietitian and nutritionist. And today I'm very excited to be presenting on celiac disease for Celiac Awareness Week with Free From and Allergy. A massive thank you to Free From and Allergy for having me back for another session. I love working with this community. It's a great way to bring people together who are dealing with similar struggles or of food intolerance, allergies, and gut symptoms. So today I'm really excited to be talking on the topic of celiac disease and IBS, answering the question, is it celiac disease or IBS, or is it both? So let's get into it. So this is me. So I am a gut health focused dietitian, an APD and nutritionist. I work predominantly in private practice for FODMAP Nutrition and Dietetics, working one-on-one with individuals to support them when they're struggling with debilitating gut issues and find relief from gut symptoms, and then to be able to eat with ease, enjoy food and enjoy life again. So that's what I'm really passionate about. I see a lot of people with IBS. I see people with celiac disease, food intolerances, SIBO, reflux, a lot of different gut-related conditions, also some women's health and some general health and well-being as well. I have a bit of a passion for environmental sustainability, and I absolutely love to cook and I love food. So I do have a bit of a focus on culinary nutrition as well in how I work. So today I will be covering what is celiac disease and breaking that down, what is IBS, the similarities and the differences between the two. We'll also be talking about diagnosis of both celiac disease and IBS, and about particularly the celiac disease testing process. We'll be talking about the gluten challenge and how to do that on a low FODMAP diet, breaking down wheat into its smaller parts, so looking at gluten and fructans in particular, and then asking the question, how do you determine what your food triggers are? So hopefully this will be an insightful presentation today. So to start with, what is celiac disease? Being Celiac Awareness Week, I'm guessing most of you already know this, but I have to touch on it. So celiac disease is not an allergy and it's not an intolerance. So it's a little bit of a strange area. It's actually an autoimmune disorder where the immune system actually reacts abnormally to when you eat gluten. And this can lead to damage to the small intestine. And this typically results in malabsorption of nutrients because the small intestine is the part of our digestive tract that absorbs most of our nutrition. So when that's damaged, we can malabsorb nutrients, and it can also lead to pretty uncomfortable gastrointestinal symptoms and other systemic symptoms as well, and other complications that I'll get into. It affects about 1.5% of Australians, and about 80% are undiagnosed, which is in part because it can be asymptomatic and also because the testing process can be quite a few steps to actually get a proper diagnosis. So I mentioned the small intestine just then. Now, the damage in celiac disease occurs to the villi. So they're like little fingers. If you imagine your small intestine, which is on the left here, it's actually like a long tube. It's actually quite long, even though it's called the small intestine. But it does have a really nice range of surface area to absorb nutrients, and that's thanks to these little finger-like projections. So imagine all the food has to travel past all of them to get absorbed in the body. And in celiac disease, these become flattened. So imagine that they're quite damaged and flattened, and there's not as much room for there to be absorption of nutrients, which is where these complications can occur from. On the right here, this is what the villi look like under a microscope, but this is healthy villi rather than the celiac diseased villi. What is IBS? So it's short for Irritable Bowel Syndrome. It's what we call a functional gastrointestinal disorder. So it involves symptoms of abdominal pain, bloating, flatulence, altered bowel habits. So that can be diarrhea or constipation or sometimes both. It affects quite a lot of people. So about 1 in 7 people. If you know 7 people, you probably know someone who has IBS, whether or not they've told you. And that's about 15% of the global population. The underlying cause of IBS isn't really known, but we do have several factors that can play a role in developing the condition. That includes having a really sensitive gut, dysbiosis, so an imbalance of bacteria, altered gut motility, so the time that it takes for you to process food, and also a bit of a miscommunication between the gut and the brain. So if we break down IBS, there are multiple subtypes. We have IBS-C, which is when you have constipation predominant symptoms, IBS-D, which is when you have diarrhea predominant symptoms, and then there's a mixed type where you can alternate between the two. Some people can change from one subtype to another as well. That's quite common. And there is also another subtype called IBS-U, IBS unspecified, which is basically when you meet the criteria for IBS, but don't really fall into the individual criteria for each of these different subtypes here. I posted this image on the left on Instagram recently, and it just had a lot of people sharing it because, you know, I can explain the definitions of these two conditions, but particularly, you know, in IBS, it's the personal experience can be quite upsetting and quite debilitating. You can have a read through that, and that's kind of what it might feel like for somebody who has IBS. And celiac disease can certainly be quite debilitating if left unmanaged, and can really impact one's quality of life as well. I actually have grown up grown up in a household with someone with celiac disease. So my mum has had celiac disease for over 20 years, and I understand the anxiety that can come with celiac disease of not knowing whether you're going to get gluten or, you know, accidental gluten contamination, and the symptoms of that can be really severe. They also can be asymptomatic, which is also quite stressful in itself. But yeah, I completely understand how uncomfortable it can be, and also with IBS as well. These are the kind of people that I work with every day in the clinic as well. So we want to find a way that we can, you know, manage these two conditions, but also improve your quality of life through doing that. So the question, can you have both celiac disease and IBS? Let's look into that. What we have found, or what some research has found, is that 38% of people with celiac disease experience IBS-type symptoms. So what could be going on? There's a few factors. One could be that there's continued gluten ingestion, even though you have a diagnosis of celiac disease. You might be thinking that you're gluten-free, but there may actually be small amounts of gluten hidden in the diet. And I'll get into how small of amount of gluten you should be consuming. It's basically zilch. So damage to the small intestine in celiac disease may also lead to a reduction of digestive enzymes. So for example, lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, the sugar in milk. And it may also lead to malabsorption of a number of sugars, particularly the FODMAPs, so fructose, lactose, fructans, and I'll get into those soon too. You can have altered gut motility, and it may even, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth may also be what's going on here. And IBS might even just be developed as a separate condition. So it may just be related to stress, for example, due to that gut-brain miscommunication. So the symptoms. On the left here, we've got symptoms that are predominant for mainly celiac disease, anemia, weight loss, osteoporosis, infertility, nutrient deficiencies, mouth ulcers. This is a particular type of skin rash, and then it can also be asymptomatic. That's really important to know. IBS, on the other hand, is all about the symptoms, so it's symptomatic, and they include the bloating, the diarrhea, the abdominal pain, cramps, some fatigue as well is quite common. But all of those IBS symptoms can occur in celiac disease, so they definitely overlap as well. In celiac disease, in IBS, you might, you know, have someone who does have some anemia, but that's not necessarily related to the IBS that's causing that. So that would be a separate reason. But this is why it's really important to get tested for celiac disease, even if you think that it's just IBS. If you're unsure, it's worth definitely speaking to your doctor about this, because the symptoms do overlap. And the complications. So celiac disease is really serious, and if it's untreated, i.e. if you're not following a strict gluten-free diet, then it can lead to a number of quite severe complications. So anemia, osteoporosis, inflammation in the systemic part of the body, so around the body, infertility and miscarriage, deficiencies, even intestinal lymphomas, that skin condition that I mentioned before, and autoimmune diseases can also occur as a result of celiac disease too. So if it's untreated, it can be pretty damaging to the body. We want to be really careful of making sure we're sticking to that strict gluten-free diet. IBS doesn't increase your risk of any other structural gut conditions or gut diseases. So it is associated with really uncomfortable symptoms, but it doesn't cause damage to the gut long term, especially. So it can, though, have a really significant impact on one's quality of life and impact someone's mental health. There may be anxiety about the symptoms you're experiencing, or even feeling quite depressed about them. So while it doesn't have those serious complications in terms of the structure of your body and what's going on in your body from a disease perspective, it can impact quality of life. So how do you know? How do you know what you have, if you have celiac disease or not? Well, there is quite a process when it comes to testing. So for celiac disease, the diagnosis must be confirmed by a small bowel biopsy. So this is a gastroscopy procedure where a gastroenterologist will look under a microscope at the actual small intestine and see what's happening there. In practice, what we might do is, instead of going straight to that level, there may be a process of testing which can involve a gene test. This is not a diagnostic test, but what it does tell you is whether you have a gene, because celiac disease is genetic. So whether you have a gene that may increase your risk of developing celiac disease. And you don't need to eat gluten before you do the gene test in the diet necessarily. So if you've already cut out a lot of wheat sources, you can do that test without introducing the wheat. There is then a blood test for the antibodies for celiac disease, which is called celiac serology. And then we also have the gastroscopy and biopsy to confirm that diagnosis. Those last two have to be done. They require gluten loading. So a gluten challenge where you eat gluten leading up to the test in order to get an accurate result. So if you're getting symptom relief after you've eliminated gluten from your diet, that cannot diagnose celiac disease. That's really important to understand. We really do need valid testing, and that's essential for diagnosis. So that biopsy is really important. So IBS testing, is there a test for IBS? Not really. There's not a definitive diagnostic test. In practice, what generally happens is a doctor or maybe a dietitian or gastroenterologist will screen for and rule out other conditions or causes of the symptoms. So that could be celiac disease, it could be inflammatory bowel disease and endometriosis and a colon cancer and a number of other things there. We do actually have, though, a diagnostic criteria for IBS. So it's called the Rome for Diagnostic Criteria. Rome Foundation does a lot in terms of gut health, and they do regularly update their criteria for diagnoses of these gut conditions. This one, the diagnosis is that you have recurrent abdominal pain on average 1 day a week, and it has to have lasted for 3 months, but also is associated with 2 or more of these dot points. So related to defecation, so when you're related to when you're going to the toilet and doing a poo, associated with a change in the frequency of your stools, and associated with the appearance of the stool change there. So now let's look at the gluten challenge. So I mentioned before, with the celiac testing, you do need to load or consume gluten prior to doing the serology, the antibody test, and the biopsy. Now, what this involves is consuming about 6 to 10 grams of gluten each day for 6 weeks before doing those tests. If you have already been eating gluten and you've been eating this amount, you don't necessarily need to do a challenge because you've already done that. But if you've cut wheat products out of your diet or reduced them, you might actually be needing to do a gluten challenge before the test. So 10 grams of gluten is about 4 slices of wheat bread. Now, this might be really daunting if you think that wheat is triggering your gut symptoms. So there is a way of doing it where you're using low FODMAP foods, which are low in fructans, and they still contain gluten. So they can reduce the symptoms that you might experience doing a gluten challenge, but you still will be consuming enough gluten before doing that test. So there's an example here of a few different food items that I recommend my clients to use. It can be a sourdough bread that's made from wheat or rye or spelt. It can be soba noodles that are made with wheat. You can use flours that actually do contain gluten, but the fructan part is low. So that's that's a really interesting sort of way of doing it as well. And there is a particular flour called vital wheat gluten flour, which is basically predominantly gluten, which you can use too. Things like small biscuits and pretzels do have a low FODMAP serve size. So spacing those out as snacks between your meals throughout the day is another way of doing this. So the management of celiac disease and IBS. Celiac disease requires a strict gluten-free diet for life. That is the only way to manage it and treat it. This means no traces of gluten, and to the point where in Australia, gluten-free has to be defined or is defined as less than 3 parts per million of gluten. So if you think of 1 million grains of sand, it has to be less than 3 of them containing gluten, if that's one other way of looking at it. IBS, on the other hand, has a number of different options for management. So usually we look at one or more of these ones, the low FODMAP diet, looking at your movement, your hydration, fiber, supplements can be useful as well, stress management, medications, gut hypnotherapy, and other dietary strategies. Generally, I find more than one solution works for most people. So we do a bit of a holistic approach and it works really well to help manage the symptoms. So let's talk about wheat as well as rye and barley. So when we're looking at wheat, I like to break it down into what the potential triggers could be. On the left here, we've got protein, which includes gluten. It's one of the proteins in wheat, and this is the one that is definitely an issue if you have celiac disease. Then we have carbohydrates. So wheat is made up of a lot of starch, and one of these carbohydrates, short chain carbohydrates, is called fructans. Now these form part of the O in FODMAP, if you've heard about FODMAPs. Then we have other potential triggers, amylase, trypsin inhibitors, lectins, food chemicals, can be other potential triggers that we find in wheat-based products, breads and other wheat-based products as well. I'm not really going to go too much into detail with those because it's a whole other topic in itself, but let's look quite specifically at the gluten and the fructan component of wheat. So I mentioned FODMAPs, and it might just sound like all a bit of a weird word, so I'm going to go into it. So FODMAPs are what we call short chain carbohydrates. Sometimes they're called sugars, but they do mean the same sort of thing when we're talking about FODMAPs. Now, it's an acronym in itself, FODMAP. And what it stands for is fermentable. So that's talking about just what all these sugars do in the gut. They can all be fermented, producing. So thinking like making beer, for example, it gets bubbly and gassy, so that fermentation is occurring. And then the other letters are all just different names for the sugars. A is an and, which is nice little relief from all these long words. But the oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols are just scientific words that breaks down these sugars like lactose, fructose, sorbitol, and fructans is one of them as well. And that's what I'm looking at specifically here. So the O group oligosaccharides, one of them is fructans. And oligo means few, saccharide means sugar. So these are a few sugars lined up in a chain, just like that little green chain on the left there. And these fructans are found in wheat, rye, and barley, same as the grains that gluten is found in. They're also found in things like onion and garlic and some fruit and vegetables. And what they're good at doing is feeding our gut bacteria. So they do have benefits. They're not unhealthy, but if you have IBS, the way that they feed the gut bacteria, that fermentation can upset your gut and lead to some symptoms. So it can trigger abdominal pain and bloating in IBS. So the question then is it really, when we're talking about, you might have heard of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So if you're confirmed you don't have celiac disease, you've done the test, ruled it out, but you're still reacting to wheat. The question here is it actually a gluten sensitivity, or potentially is it a non-celiac wheat sensitivity? This is a really interesting study that looked specifically at that. It was done in Norway in 2017, where they had a group of people that had confirmed no celiac disease. They'd done the testing, and they did have self-reported non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So they were reacting to gluten or reacting to something in wheat, even though they had no celiac disease. what they did with these people was that they had this muesli bar. I'm going to talk about the one on the right for a second just to start with. So placebo muesli bar, low FODMAP and gluten-free. Then what they did, they took the same recipe and made the same muesli bars, but they added in gluten, just gluten into it. And then they also took another one of this low FODMAP gluten-free muesli bar and they added in that fructan only. So what we have here is we're looking at specifically, is it gluten or is it fructans that's going to upset their gut? So everybody consumed all the different muesli bars and had a washout period where they stopped eating and let symptoms settle down and then moved on to the next muesli bar. And they were blinded, so they didn't know what they were having, which is important as well. And what they found was really, really interesting. So the gluten bar, the one that they all thought they were reacting to was the gluten, actually had no significant effects on IBS-type symptoms, on bloating, on pain, on altered bowel habits. The fructan bar significantly induced IBS symptoms. So it did increase their symptoms and they did get triggered from it. And then the placebo bar actually had more reported symptoms than when they ate the gluten bar. So they were reacting more when they had the placebo compared to the gluten was the least symptomatic, which is really, really interesting. So it's a really confusing to kind of break down. It can be a bit tricky to break down gluten-free and low FODMAP because there's a lot of overlap between the two, but they're not the same. On the left here, we have foods that are gluten-free, but they are high FODMAP. So that's things like your onion, your garlic, soy flour, milk because of the lactose, honey because of the fructose. So there's legumes there as well. So they all can be high in FODMAPs, but they are safe gluten-free foods, so good for a gluten-free diet. And then on the right, we have low FODMAP foods that actually do contain gluten. So this is things like sourdough bread, if it's made from wheat or rye or spelt. We've got low fructan flour that I mentioned in the gluten challenge slide, things like soy sauce, oats in Australia. That's a bit of a topic in itself, but in Australia, they are not allowed to be called gluten-free and considered to contain gluten. Beer, cross-contamination is also there. So when you, for example, use the same spread to spread on a wheat piece of bread and then spread that again using the same knife to spread onto a gluten-free piece of bread, that would be fine for a low FODMAP diet, but not fine in the case of celiac disease. And then in the middle here, we have this middle ground where it's actually low FODMAP and gluten-free. So we've got things like tamari, gluten-free soy sauce. We've got quinoa and rice and buckwheat, gluten-free plain flour that's made from potato starch, rice starch, etc. And we've got a lactose-free milk in there. So that's this really interesting area where if you have celiac disease and you have IBS and react to FODMAPs, this is a kind of area that is probably the dietary strategy that might help relieve some of those symptoms in IBS. So that middle area, this is it expanded into what it looks like in food because it sounds like it would be really restrictive and bland. And it's not something that I would recommend staying on long term in terms of eliminating all FODMAPs. But if you did need to do it for a short period of time, work with a dietitian or a practitioner who's really going to support you. This is an example of the food I cook at home that is low FODMAP and gluten-free, some of the food I cook. And what the aim here is to just show you that there is a lot of variety. And this is why I love culinary nutrition. I love how we can use food and cooking to create delicious food that we enjoy eating. And if you do find this kind of stuff interesting, you can jump over to our Instagram page. I do a lot of recipe stories on there as well. So in summary, how do you know what your triggers are? Firstly, get accurately tested for celiac disease if you think or you suspect that wheat or gluten is causing you some issues. So you have to do that through a doctor and potentially a gastroenterologist, and you can get some support from a gut health dietitian to help you there as well. They'll work with the doctor and the gastro. Do the gluten challenge properly. So make sure you are doing that. If you've cut wheat out of your diet, you need to reintroduce it before testing. Work with a healthcare team. So that could be a GP, a gastroenterologist, and a dietitian. And that would be to help with planning a gluten-free diet if you have confirmed celiac disease, to know about label reading, to know about what foods, what grains are safe for you to have. There are some gluten-free ones, so that's a really important part. And in managing your IBS symptoms, work with a doctor or dietitian as well, particularly with the dietary side of things and lifestyle management as well. And then you can understand what your triggers are, eat with ease, so not have to not know what's going on, and learn how to manage them in a sustainable way and enjoy life. So if you do need some support and you're thinking I'm a little bit lost with what my gut is doing right now, you can certainly contact me for appointments at FODMAP Nutrition and Dietetics. There's our links up on there and our social pages as well. I hope you had I hope this presentation was insightful and you learned a thing or two. And I really look forward to the rest of Celiac Awareness Week and seeing all the other presentations involved. I'm so glad to be working with Free From and Allergy, and excited to be part of this community. So have a great Celiac Awareness Week and take care. Bye everyone.